Good evening and welcome to tonight's program. My name is Tanya and I will be your co-host for tonight's virtual program, Emancipation and Liberation, Where Do We Go From Here? Tonight's program is being recorded and the format will be as follows. I will introduce Io, one of tonight's guests, and Io will introduce Dr. Cooper. Dr. Cooper will introduce tonight's panelists, followed by a discussion. Once discussion is over, we'll follow up with questions from the audience. I will be keeping an eye on the chat feature, which is located at the bottom of your screen. If you're having any technical issues, you can post them there. The chat feature is also where you can post your questions for tonight for the panelists. Most technical issues can be solved by leaving the webinar and rejoining. The Leave Meeting button is located at the bottom right-hand side of your screen. You can rejoin the webinar by clicking on the Zoom link, which was emailed to you. Now that our housekeeping details are out of the way, let's begin. We are pleased to be a part of tonight's virtual program, Emancipation and Liberation. Where do we go from here? Tonight's program is in partnership with Halifax Regional Municipality. Please join me in welcoming Io Aladajabi, Senior Advisor, Office of Diversity and Inclusion, African Nova Scotian Affairs Integration Office, Halifax Regional Municipality. Io?
Thank you very much, Tanya, and thank you for the welcome and the kind introduction. I'm so thankful tonight that the Halifax Regional Municipality's Office of Diversity and Inclusion and African Nova Scotia Affairs Integration Office is partnering with the Halifax Public Library to bring tonight's event to everyone. Before we begin anything tonight, it's important for us to do the right thing first. So we will begin by acknowledging that tonight's event is taking place in Mi'kmaq, the ancestral traditional lands of the Mi'kmaq people. We all acknowledge the peace and friendship treaties signed in this territory and recognize that we are all treaty people. For tonight's event to run smoothly, we have also been working very diligently with our moderator for tonight, Dr. Afua Cooper. Dr. Cooper is a professor of Black Studies in the Faculty of Arts and Social Science at Dalhousie University. She is director of the Black People's History of Canada project, and she holds Killam Research. She also holds a Killam Research chair. Dr. Cooper was recently appointed the Canadian UNESCO representative for the UN's Slave Roots Project. So tonight, we're gonna have her moderating this event and helping everything to run smoothly. Dr. Cooper?
Thank you, Ayo. Thank you, Ayo, for the opportunity. Thanks to HRM and thanks also to the Halifax Public Library for inviting me to moderate this evening's panel on Emancipation Day. As we know, August 1st is Emancipation Day. And so this panel is held in honor of that day. Before we continue, I want to do the ancestors acknowledgement, the African ancestors acknowledgement. And it goes like this. We honor the African ancestors for their struggles, resilience, and victories. We honor the continent of Africa that has given so much to the world. Truly, Africa ascends. Tonight we have three distinguished panelists who will shed light on this issue of emancipation or liberation. And these panelists are Professor Gregory Adolphe-Nazaire, Professor Barb Hamilton-Hinch, and Professor Isaac Saney. And later on, I will read their bios, give a more fulsome biography of each panel. But I want to take this opportunity to provide some introductory remarks with respect to the Emancipation Day and with respect to the Abolition Act. Emancipation Day came about in the British Empire on August 1st, 1834, as a result of the Abolition Act that was passed in the British Parliament on August 28, 1833. It took effect on the 1st of August, 1834. So we are now in the 187th year of this act was passed. And at the time of its passage, William IV was King of England, the King of United Kingdom of Great Britain and of the British Empire. It covers the majority of the enslaved people who were freed were in the British colonies of the Caribbean and also in South America, meaning British Guyana in South America. Enslaved people in South Africa, in Mauritius, in Ile Réunion were also freed by this act. We know that some enslaved people within British North America, i.e. Canada, were also freed by this act. The British Parliament paid 20 million pounds in 40,000 separate awards to the slaveholders, to the slave owners. And this money, this 20 million pounds, was financed mainly by public debt. In fact, 40%, the 20 million pounds accounted for 40% of the British annual expenditure. And Professor Nicholas Draper, in his book, The Price of Emancipation, and there's a website called The Legacies of British Slave Ownership, put on by University College London, shed a lot of light on this phenomenon. So if, when you're able, please peruse the website. It's called Legacies of British Slave Ownership, to see who received what. Slave owners range from the Anglican Church, members of the House of Lords, members of the British monarchy, ordinary people, merchants, so on and so forth. As I said, 40,000 separate awards were paid out. The British government borrowed 15 million pounds from the bankers Nathan Mayer Rothschild and Moses Montefiore. The other 5 million were taken from public funds. But only the enslaved people in the colonies received their freedom, you think, on August 1st, 1834? Not quite. Only children aged 6 and under were fully freed by this act. In fact, people 6 and older were to continue working for the next 6 years as apprentices. And this period was called the Apprenticeship Period. And that meant that the British government thought, well, we can't just free all the slaves and take away the labor from the slave owner. And by the same token, we need to prepare the enslaved people for full freedom. So let's put them in an apprenticeship program, which was unpaid. The conditions under apprenticeship were slave-like. There was tremendous abuse. So it was like slavery. It was slavery. And the Africans were to be liberated between 1838 and 1840, gain their full freedom between these two dates. So you see the whole, one can be cynical and say, this was a great lie. This was a great white lie. You say that you're freeing fully the enslaved people on August 1st, 1834, but you held back. Only children 6 and under. And let's face it, children 6 and under can't do much heavy labor. So you free them, but older, people 6 and older were to continue working. The British government did not pay the money back until 2015, or I should say the taxpayers did not pay the money back. And in many ways, the enslaved people and their descendants themselves were the one who paid back the money to the Rothschild family. As Professor Hilary Beckles notes, the Abolition Act was one of the most racist pieces of legislation to come out of the British Parliament, as it recognized the Africans as property and not human beings. And that's why they paid the slaveholders, because property in British common law was sacrosanct, it was sacred. So if you're going to take away a man's property or a woman's property, as the government did, then you have to pay the owner for that property. Property was sacrosanct. And so Africans were still thought of as property, not as human beings. And that's the key reason that the Africans themselves were not compensated for the centuries of labor that they performed for free, they and their descendants, for the British government. They did not receive 1 penny. They remained landless. You know, after 1838 came when full freedom happened. They remained landless. They had no political power. The planters still controlled society. Planters still controlled economy, the politics, you name it. The planters were still fully in power. And so in many instances, in this issue that we're talking about, emancipation or liberation, at the end of the day, it is an issue of reparations. I must add that there were various emancipations throughout the slaveholding Americas. Cuba and Puerto Rico, there the enslaved Africans gained their emancipation, if you will, in 1868. In Cuba, 1868, from 1868 to 1888, it was a protracted kind of process, likewise in Puerto Rico. In the US South, 1863 to 1865. In the US North, various states and colonies passed various acts of emancipation toward the end of the 18th century and into the 19th century. In Brazil, slavery was fully outlawed in 1888, Colombia in 1851, Mexico in 1822, 23, and in the French colonies, 1848, and sometimes 1863. It depends on which particular colony we're looking at. In the Dutch colonies, certainly 1863. Haiti is a special case, a significant case, an important case, because the Haitians, enslaved people in Saint-Domingue, as Haiti was then called, waged a 13-year revolution against the colonizing power, France, the slaveholding power, and gained their own freedom. And in many ways, Haiti set the stage for full emancipations to occur within the Americas. And ironically, Haiti had to pay France reparations, which must be the supremacist paradox. And what I mean by that is that usually it's the losers that pay reparations. Haiti won the war. The winner does not pay reparation. But because Haiti was boycotted by the world, if I may put it that way, and then France in 1825 came in the Haitian seas, in the Caribbean Sea, with gunboats and military ships, and basically forced Haiti to pay reparations so that Haiti could be recognized as a sovereign power. And that debt took over a century to be paid. But one of our speakers will address that issue. So I want to say right now, we are in this moment within the world. We are in a world in which global protest against anti-Blackness has become the norm. In the United States, you see the voting rights of Black people being rolled back, which is such a surreal thing happening because we thought that matter was settled. In Brazil, you see Black bodies being mowed down not only by COVID, but by the military state, the militarized state that is Brazil. In Haiti, we see just recently, President Juvenal Moïse was assassinated in cold blood. And right now, in other places in the African diaspora, in Cuba, we see Cuba being strangled by the economic boycott and also by the COVID-19. So we are at this crucial juncture in our history as people in Africa and in the African diaspora. And so the question is important: emancipation or liberation? Where do we go from here? And to start us off, We have Professor Barbara Hamilton-Hinch. She is from the historical African Nova Scotian communities of Beachville and Cherrybrook. She's the mother of 3 amazing boys. Barb is currently employed at Dalhousie University as an associate professor in the School of Health and Human Performance at Dalhousie, and she's the Assistant Vice Provost Equity and the co-lead for improving the health outcomes of people of African descent research flagship with Healthy Population Institute. Her work examines the impact of structural and systemic racism on diverse populations, particularly people of African descent. So it's with great pleasure that I present Dr. Barbara Hamilton-Hinch. Thank you, Barb.
Thank you, Dr. Cooper, for that introduction and for the presentation. And I just want to know that my presentation is going to have a different focus because I knew that a lot of the history context was going to be put in place. So I'm very humbled and honored to be here this evening and to share with the 16 colleagues. I'm looking forward to our discussion as well. And before I begin, I appreciate the acknowledgement that Io gave and also Dr. Cooper in acknowledging our ancestors. And for me, this evening, it's especially important for me to recognize the shoulders of the ancestors that I stand on. And I name specifically my mother, Bernice Bundy McLaughlin Hamilton, and my father, Norman Hamilton, for raising me and lifting me up, and for all of my ancestors who have made it possible for me to be here this evening. And my talk will probably be a little different from Dr. Isaac and Dr. Gregory. And I want to come to this talk this evening from a community lens and taking it from that grassroots point of what does liberation and emancipation mean for me as a person of African descent, as an African Nova Scotian woman, as a health educator, and as a researcher. And in exploring the meaning of Slavery Abolition Act within the contemporary context of the struggle for racial justice, it's important to remind ourselves that we did not start out as slaves. And for those of us that have been educated in Nova Scotia and North America, most of our history has us starting as being enslaved. And raising 2 beautiful boys in the public school system in Nova Scotia, it was important for me for them to understand their history. It's important for us to understand our history and that we did not start out as slaves. And I'm sure that many of you who are joining us are aware of that as well. And we want to remind that people of African descent descended from kings and queens, orators, scientists, mathematicians, scholars, doctors. And one day I say that I'm going to advocate to have, instead of Hippocrates, the Hippocratic Oath, to have the Imhotep Oath. So when we talk about emancipation, when we talk about liberation, few people recognize the fact that Hippocrates studied under Imhotep. And Imhotep is the father of medicine and science. When we talk about liberation, emancipation, these are things that help us to become more liberated. But our school system, again, did not teach us that. We are not taught about our kingdoms, our riches, our golds, diamonds, and minerals that continues to be raped from Mother Africa even today. Not long ago, there was another huge, beautiful diamond, I believe, found in one of our countries in the continent. And who is going to profit from that? It's not going to be the descendants of that country. It's not going to be the residents of that country. It's important for me to set that context because as an 8th generation African Nova Scotian, that is not the history I was taught, that I had to learn that I could stand proud of who I am. And I'm thankful for the number of people who saw it important that I knew my history. For me, that is part of the liberation. That's part of what we need to move forward, is making sure that those who are coming behind us, those who are with us, and even those who are ahead of us, know and understand their history. Today, as we begin to launch and acknowledge the Emancipation Day, I do want to point out that before the federal government officially recognized it as a day, people around the world have been commemorating this day. In Nova Scotia and the organization of Uncle Nobazizwe, people of Africans have been gathering on the shores of Africville to mark this important day. Being there and witnessing the somber presentation of many who acknowledge their ancestors is a reminder of who we are. And I am thankful to Senator Wanda Thomas Bernard for pushing this bill forward so that nationally we can reflect on this day together, all people, not just people of African descent, but all people, to remember, and to the province of Nova Scotia for also recognizing its significance. I was fortunate to have the opportunity to travel to Mother Africa a number of times to connect with my ancestors. I claim Sierra Leone as one of my ancestry homes and had the chance to travel there and spend time with family. When I think about liberation and emancipation and about some of my brothers and sisters of the Jewish background who are able to travel to Israel as their birthright passage, part of emancipation and liberation would be for me, for every person of African descent, to be able to make that journey and stand on the shores of Mother Africa. I had the chance to travel to Bunce Island and saw the places where my ancestors were taken from, to Ghana and visit the places where my ancestors were enslaved, washed my skin in the same river of the last bath before they made their final journey, as well as to Guinea Conakry. Each trip I was filled with pain, grief, pride, and power. And one quote that has forever changed me was one shared in Ghana when they were celebrating their 50th year of independence. And it was the Minister of Tourism. And she said, welcome home to those of us from Nova Scotia, and said, welcome home, sons and daughters of our strongest ancestors. We are sorry we could not save you. Welcome home, sons and daughters of our strongest ancestors. What she was acknowledging was the journey that many of us took, that we were made to take, and how we had survived that journey to come back. Those words will forever stay with me. So in exploring the meaning of Emancipation Day and the Slavery Abolition Act, which Dr. Cooper talked about, which became law on August 1st, 1834, to end the practice of slavery around the world, I have to ask myself, are we emancipated? Although August 1st, 1834 was the day that slavery around the world was to cease as people of African descent, we were not seen or considered free. In Nova Scotia, we remained under the guise of sundown laws. And so many of you may be aware of that in Nova Scotia, we had to be in the house, in our community, before the sun came down, or you could be taken to jail, you could be punished, you could be beaten. Your life was in your own hands. And so we did our best as Black people to avoid lynching and death. We continued to experience a segregated school system into the 1960s. And we still see some of those remnants of how that has impacted our children. Some of our parents have a grade 3 education and had to leave school early and work because of the continuation of the injustices and racial injustice that they experienced. We cannot keep ignoring the injustices that people of African descent continue to experience in employment, education, health, justice, and so on. As a researcher recently, I've been examining the education system, the justice system, and the health system in Nova Scotia. My PhD looked at the impact of racism on the health and well-being of women of African descent, which was a research project started under Dr. Wanda Thomas Bernard, and I'm thankful for Dr. Afua Cooper, who helped to be on my committee and make sure that it got completed. And hearing the pain of what people are still experiencing in 2021 as people of African descent. I remain worried for my children and their grandchildren. When I see friends of mine, most recently in Nova Scotia, we know the story of Inspector Dean Simmons and his partner, lawyer Angela Simmons, that experienced and how that reinforces our struggles for racial justice. So are we free? Are we emancipated? Nothing can explain away that situation. Although none of us were there with them, we have relived and experienced with them some of what they felt. I'm sure that made us reflect on how does the world see us? How does society see us? When a school system does not recognize our Black brilliance, when a healthcare system ignores our pain and thinks we can handle it because after all, we are descendants of slaves. when our mental health challenges are misdiagnosed as criminal behavior. And I know that some of you can relate to what I am saying. So again, I ask, are we liberated? Are we emancipated? This day creates that time to reflect on that. We also look at, in some of the research I'm doing, the impact of COVID, and Dr. Cooper mentioned that as well. In the justice system, those who have been incarcerated in their families, and how that is impacting them. And I'm so happy that most recently we'll be investing in a justice institute that will look more closely and support individuals who have experienced challenges in being incarcerated, and how we can support them better. So it is evident to me that we have not reached full emancipation or emancipation. So will this day, will this national day, this provincial day, this municipal day of recognition of the Slavery Abolition Act make people see me as an African queen? Or will people continue to try to erase my existence? That's something we have to ask ourselves. As I begin to think about this talk today, books came flooding through my head, authors, researchers, thinking of Dr. Joy DeGruy and the post-traumatic slave syndrome, Carter G. Watson, the miseducation of the Negro, Beverly Tatum, why are all the Black kids sitting together in the cafeteria? And even Sylvia Hamilton's work in Speaking from the Heart of Black Nova Scotians, The Skin I'm In, Dr. Afua Cooper's work with the hanging of Angelique. The list goes on. Desmond Cole, The Skin I'm In. The lives that have been lost in Canada and the US worldwide. I do recognize the progress we have made in many areas. And I recognize the work in the institutions, particularly one that I am currently working at. But there is still more to do. So where do we go from here? We cannot be satisfied with what we have accomplished thus far. We must continue to push forward, continue to fight for equity in the school system, in the healthcare system, in the justice system. We must unite collectively to fight against racism, which is well and alive in Nova Scotia, in Canada, in North America, across the world, as Dr. Cooper talked about. Even though we've had various positions in different places of government that have been increased in university, it's not enough. We must not rest as our ancestors have not rested. So I say that we have to continue to work hard collectively as a people, to keep working towards emancipation and liberation. But we have not, in my humble opinion, fully achieved that yet. But we have seen the fruits of our labor, the fruits of the labor of our ancestors, but there is still work to do. So I'm now going to turn it back to Dr. Cooper, and I look forward to the discussion that we'll be having this evening. And thank you for your time.
Thank you, Barbara, for such a heartfelt presentation. It was truly wonderful. You raised a lot of issues, which I'm sure our audience will take up some of them with you. The one that stood out for me, or there are several that stood out for me, but I'll just name one, is that you talk about the right. It should be a right for all Africans in the diaspora to journey to Africa at least once, to the birthplace of their ancestors. Thank you again. I'm going to introduce Professor Gregory Adolphe-Nazaire. Greg is a finance and business professor at the Rose School of Business at Dalhousie University, and he also holds an appointment at Dalhousie's Faculty of Agriculture. This award-winning professional has done important work with the Black Business Initiative, popularly known as the BBI, with respect to financial capacity in the African Nova Scotian community. Professor Nazaire also serves as special advisor to the Vice President, Academic and Research, and Provost at the Nova Scotia College of Art and Design, popularly known as NASCAD. Greg, without further ado, I turn it over to you. Thank you for joining the panel.
Thank you, Dr. Cooper, and thanks everyone for inviting me. And yes, I think it's a very interesting topic, emancipation. And I think we have two great speeches from both Dr. Cooper and Dr. Hamilton-Hinch regarding the very, the very definition of it. So if we go and we think about the word emancipation, the question that we ask is, are we emancipated? And that's a very interesting question to ask. And my answer will be yes. And that may surprise you, but when I say yes, we're emancipated, it's not our definition of emancipation, but this is another definition of emancipation, the emancipation that is controlled, that is designed, that is given. So in that context, what I mean by this is we're gonna give it to you. And if you are given something, you cannot design it yourself most of the time. And this is what we see until today when we talk about systemic racism, we talk about disparity, then we can think about the word emancipation. If we just, let's have the definition, the Oxford definition of the word emancipation. The act of freeing somebody, especially from legal, political, social controls that limit what they can do, that limit what they can do. Do we have limits as people of African descent? You bet. And when we say limit, we know what everyone knows what we're talking about. Basically, you can work as much as basically somebody else, the same intelligence, the same education sometimes, and you still cannot make it. Why are we asking the word, are we emancipated? Again, just to follow up on what Dr. Hamilton just said, it's a valid question and it's a very serious discussion. If we go back in history, we take the Haitian history. Okay, we have the first ever proclamation from slaves that we are free. It's a self-emancipation. And observers, scholars, many, they say, well, Haiti had a bad start. And sometimes they frame it like it was some sort of, bad policies or bad governance. It wasn't. When the US were fighting the British, they had the full support of a empire such as France. They were trading with the Spanish empire. Haiti had no one. It's almost like today, you are in country and you have Russia against you, you have the US against you, you have France against you, you have China against you, you have Japan against you, alone. Why? Because it wasn't the other emancipation. So the one someone of African descent earned doesn't go well with the definition of the establishment of the word emancipation. When they say free someone, especially from legal, political, social control that limit, we have limits. And when I say a limit, it's really a limit that is independent from our capacity. It means that sometimes you can do whatever you want. You can do, it doesn't matter how smart you are, how hardworking you are, you're still gonna fall short. And that's why we heard about, the word diversity, inclusion, stuff like that. It's because something is amiss. So the word definition is really at the eye of the beholder. Depends on who's talking, who's defining. So we take the example of Haiti, where it challenges, at that time, challenges the very existence of these colonies, the very existence of these empires, because it was based purely, simply on slavery. It's almost like a zero-sum game. And Haiti, although they helped other countries in the Latin America, never got invited to be at the table. Not until 1862, the US actually recognized Haiti. So again, what you have now, you have the word emancipation that will not be what it is if it's not validated by somebody else. And I'm glad Professor Ange just asked that question, are we emancipated? People will say, yes, we are. But not the way we think we are. Not the pure sense, the pure definition of the word emancipation. If we take, for instance, you take countries such as France, what they have the slogan, which basically liberté, égalité, fraternité, means, freedom, liberty, brotherhood, and equality. Canada, we have the country of human rights. The US, you have the beacon, the shining house on the hill, the beacon of democracy and freedom. So it's a different version, different brands of the same concept, emancipation, freedom for all. Are we sure we want to say that really we have equality for all? We know that's not the case. Just take a look at the stats. And when someone say, well, it's because you're not working hard enough, that's not true. Unless you think there is a group that is literally genetically, defined to be bad or to be losers. And we know that's not true. We have plenty of examples where you have marginalized communities, people who actually got away. When I say got away, saved themselves from a life of poverty, crime, and drugs, stuff like that, try to make it out, and they still have that wall, right? So when we talk about emancipation, it has become really a very heavy, sometimes even politically charged word, because some fraction, the population, hopefully it's a fraction, a small fraction, cannot stand the fact to see everyone to be free without any limit, where your potential actually can take you wherever you want, wherever you can. And that's why, again, the word emancipation, it's something that actually, I'm glad we got that discussion today, but we're gonna need further discussion about it. And I think we definitely need that, because I strongly believe emancipation should not be a scary word. Emancipation, that means equality, equity, freedom for all, no limit, should not be a concept that is scary. We should take it as an opportunity, just like on the way back then, where the elite were basically transforming Atlanta into a modern city, into a world-class city, because Atlanta was basically like Birmingham, Alabama, same city, same size, same style. They say, you know what, we have to change. And we are, like James Baldwin say, too busy to make money to be racist. So sometimes equality, I'm gonna say that sometimes equality is it's something that should be embraced. Emancipation, something that should be embraced. Because if we are all Canadians, we are all in the same country, I think we should have the same opportunity, to pursue how happiness, how success. And again, we need to have a discussion about it. Charity, it's not emancipation. Equality is emancipation. Equity, emancipation. I think I would once again thank Dr. Cooper for inviting me today, and the organizers for putting that together today, because I think it's well overdue. And hopefully we gotta continue that discussion and look forward to that Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you, Greg, so much. I particularly like your getting into the heart of the definition of the word emancipation, free from economic, political, legal, and cultural control, and then applying it to the situation of Black people within Canada, within North America, in Haiti, and around the world. Also, like what you say, if you're given something that you did not design, then you're not emancipated, and that limits are placed on us as people of African descent. So those are very sobering words, and I hope we get feedback from our audience with respect to these ideas. So once again, thank you, Greg. Last but certainly not least, we have Isaac Saney. And Isaac is the director of the Transition Year Program at Dalhousie University, the groundbreaking program established in 1970 to redress the educational barriers and injustices that confront the Mi'kmaq Nation, other indigenous peoples, and the African Nova Scotian community. Isaac's teaching and scholarship encompass Africa, the Caribbean, the US, civil rights movement, Cuba, and the Black Nova Scotian community. Isaac is the recipient of several awards that recognize his work and his contribution. Without further ado, Isaac, take it away.
Thank you very much for allowing me to share some thoughts on what I think is an extremely important occasion. And I want to sort of, tailor some of what I'm going to say now to what Dr. Cooper had introduced at the beginning, which is this idea of apprenticeship, which really was some sort of mangled form of emancipation, if we may say so. And the idea that Dr. Nazaire had raised about this issue of design, of how the process of emancipation, in a sense, and these liberatory projects that we have seen imposed on Africans were not designed by Africans. I think as a historian, I think it's important to challenge the notion that slavery's abolition, particularly in the British Empire, is often portrayed as the work of conscientious and dedicated white activists, such as William Wilberforce and, for example, Granville Sharp. As dedicated and important as they played in these struggles, what often happens is that the central role played by enslaved Africans is almost invariably marginalized. Richard Hart, for example, one of the foremost scholars on African resistance in the Caribbean to the institution of slavery, observed that there appears to exist a quote, a desire, perhaps subconscious, to erase the record of Africans' decisive contribution and participation in the anti-slavery struggle, end of quote. He emphasizes, for example, that huge numbers of enslaved Africans struggled for their freedom with unflagging determination. I always point out that, when we look at the extreme brutality and viciousness and human degradation of enslavement, the transatlantic slave system, and the massive wealth that was made off of Africans that led to Europe's rise as a predominant economic power in the world and helped finance the Industrial Revolution, side by side, is Africans not as helpless spectators, okay, but active and the active agents in their own liberation, waging a constant struggle, if not a constant war, against their enslavers and against the institution that brutalized them. In fact, Eric Williams, the great scholar from the Caribbean who wrote the definitive and seminal work, Capitalism and Slavery, observed that the most dynamic and powerful social force in the colonies were the slave, i.e. the enslaved African. Greg has already spoken about the Haitian Revolution, right? And the Haitian Revolution is unique, not only because enslaved Africans rose up and overthrew not only the French imperial power, but resisted the Spanish and the British, right? And then again defeated Napoleon when he sent his brother-in-law Leclerc to try and reinstall slavery in Haiti. But Haiti was unique because unlike the French Revolution, unlike the American War of Independence, the so-called American Revolution, Haiti was the first country to recognize that people had rights by the virtue of being human beings. It abolished slavery, the first country in the Americas to do that, but it also established a very powerful concept that human beings have rights by the very dint that they exist, and so forth. And of course, one of the things about Haiti, and as we see, and Dr. Cooper mentioned the recent assassination of Moise in Haiti, Haiti and the kind of woes and wees and trials and tribulation that Haiti faces, and the fact that Haiti is often portrayed as the poorest country in the Western Hemisphere, is that the Haitian Revolution was seen as an unforgivable crime by the Western powers, and they forced Haiti to pay for it by sealing Haiti off from the rest of the world, and as Dr. Cooper so eloquently pointed out, forced them to actually pay compensation to the former and slave owners in order for Haiti to be allowed to exist, enter the international world, right, of diplomacy and commerce. And so, and it's also important to also understand, and I know we talk a lot about the impact of the French Revolution on Haiti, ideas of liberty, equality, and fraternity, which were very important ideas, but also that, you know, more than 2/3 of the enslaved Africans who rebelled in 1791 were born in Africa, and therefore themselves were bringing with them their own African ideas, their own concepts of politics, their own ideas of how society should be organized. So the Haitian Revolution was this seminal event in the struggle against enslavement. In fact, it created this idea among Europeans that while rebellions had occurred in the past, and there were numerous examples of rebellions, okay, they were seen as the economic cost of doing business. The Haitians introduced the idea that Africans could seize control of an entire society and oust the European power from that region, right? Therefore establishing, in a sense, you know, a new form of self-determination and governance and so on. But what's also important as we talk about Emancipation Day that's being marked here in Canada in the British Empire is also there's another rebellion that played a central role in accelerating the end of slavery in the British Empire. And that was the 1831 slave rebellion in Jamaica, led by Sam Sharp. Okay, and it drew its inspiration from the Haitian Revolution in many ways. The Sam Sharp Rebellion was the death knell for slavery in the British Empire. It began on December 27th and lasted well into January 1831. I won't go into detail, but it involved over more than 60,000 enslaved Africans, almost 1/5 of the enslaved population in Jamaica, right? And encompassed 226 plantations, right? And what it did was that it not only destroyed an appreciable part of the material base of the enslavement, okay, as Richard Hart points out, but it also demonstrated that slavery was now an insupportably expensive system to maintain. And in fact, while, and there's numerous reports are gone, that while the British had been considering the idea of the gradual abolition of enslavement, right, okay, over a particular period of time, so they could control how Africans would be released from chattel slavery so they could be subordinated again, there are numerous reports that happened and even debates broke out in the British Parliament where people become very concerned that, you know, if the British did not abolish slavery on their own terms, the Africans would do so. Thus, this decision from above, this Emancipation Act, was accelerated by the fear that the incessant resistance of Africans would result in another rebellion on the scale of the Haitian Revolution, which could then spread across the Caribbean with the attendant economic and political consequences for Britain. In fact, it would be a fatal blow for empire. As Richard Hart underscored, quote, the abolition of slavery was carried out from above by enactment. But barring the minor details, it was the rebellious enslaved Africans who reset the table of emancipation, end of quote. Eric Williams is even more succinct, and he says, in 1833, therefore, the alternatives were clear: emancipation from above, or emancipation from below, but emancipation. And as Dr. Cooper so ably pointed out, what emerged from this emancipation from above in order to forestall Africans taking matters into their own hands was a form of apprenticeship, okay? What they called apprenticeship, which was really an attempt to ensure that Africans would remain in a subordinate position, and more importantly, their humanity would not be recognized. And so in a question, when we think of emancipation, emancipation for the enslaved Africans meant more than just simply the release from the former legal shackles of chattel slavery, in that sense, being reduced in a sense to wage labor, but involved really a fundamental transformation of society where African humanity would be recognized. Now, when we look at the world today, and Dr. Nazaire has spoken about this, when we look at the fact that the COVID-19 pandemic and the ecological catastrophe raging around us, right, has demonstrated the inability of the system, right, to actually really truly meet human needs, we also witness that it's people of color, and particularly people of African descent, who are on the front lines of COVID, being infected and dying from it, right? Not only in North America, but also across the world. Only 1% of Africa, I was looking at the latest figures, has been vaccinated, right? I mean, this is truly astonishing, right? And so when we think of emancipation and we think of the movement for reparations, which is not just simply the idea that some economic settlement will be paid to Africans in order to compensate for their massive enslavement. It's not just simply the idea of acknowledging that the world system we live in today, with all of its inequalities, with its incredible, shall we say, accumulation of wealth in a few hands and mass immiseration in the vast majority of people, that is rooted in the transatlantic colonization of the Americas, the transatlantic slave system, and the system of inequality and unfairness, right, that has emerged in the world, right? That when we look at these things, the idea that was really central to the idea of emancipation has been carried on in the Black liberation movement through the 19th century into the 20th century, is the idea of remaking the social and economic relations that control our society. In a sense, when people talk about reparations, and when even people talk about decolonization, it's not about raging vengeance and on people of European descent. No, it's transforming the social relations that we all exist in, right? And part and parcel of that is really, when we think about emancipation for people of African descent, is challenging anti-Black racism. Anti-Black racism is the child of the transatlantic slave system, a series of systematic and cultural processes that have operated to maintain people of African descent, including Black Canadians, in subordinate positions in the political, economic, and ideological structures that exist in the world today. Okay, and these systemic and cultural processes are rooted in and spring from the history of colonization, slavery, and of course, the segregation and Jim Crow, as Dr. Hamilton-Hinch pointed out, the kind of dusk to dawn laws, the sundown laws that existed after slavery to ensure that people of African descent not only knew their place in society, but basically were placed in positions where their claims on human rights and their claims on citizenship were always problematized, right? Always seen as something that in many cases, was for many of them, was a claim that was extremely limited, right? Gerald Horne, the African-American historian, and I encourage people to read his works, points out it's not just simply a negation of human rights. It's not the negation of the rights of people of African descent. It's actually the negation of the idea that people of African descent are human beings who can have rights. And I think these ideas come out of slavery. So yes, chattel slavery ended. Okay, and one of the driving forces was African resistance, right? But as Dr. Nazaire has pointed out, the emancipation that emerged, and as Dr. Cooper demonstrated, that emerged was not designed for Africans and wasn't designed to actually give the full flowering of African freedom and African creativity, the envelope of freedom that they deserved. It was designed specifically in ways that ensured, as I've pointed out, they've remained subordinate in societies. I could mention the numerous reports, for example, that have been done from the United Nations and other institutions that demonstrate the marginalization and disenfranchisement of people of African descent in the world and in Canada, right? And of course, link its roots back to the institution of slavery, right? But we've also seen a history of resistance where Africans have tried to redesign the terms by which they were freed from chattel slavery, to give a new meaning to what emancipation means, okay? And also the idea of this Black liberatory project is not a project that only benefits people of African descent. It's a project that would benefit all of humanity. Hilary Beckles, who's the foremost scholar and activist, right? Hilary Beckles is the Vice Chancellor of the University of West Indies. He's done so much tremendous research on transatlantic slave trade in the Caribbean and so forth, and he's led the charge for reparations. he articulates that reparations is not just simply a project that benefits people of African descent, the victims of enslavement and colonization. He articulates it's a project that by the very nature requires that the entire world be transformed in ways that benefit all of us. Okay, as we see the ecological crisis emerge, as we see this pandemic demonstrate that the system is unable to protect all of us, and particularly the most vulnerable, we see that a new series of political and social and economic arrangements are desperately needed, right? And we see that in the struggle for this new world, Africans have played a central role, not only in resisting, as I said, slavery, but in trying to give us a more deeper and fuller understanding of what true emancipation means. What does it mean to truly expand the envelope of freedom and creativity, right? And so when I think of what does global liberation mean in the context of emancipation, it's an unfulfilled project, okay? Emancipation, the end of chattel slavery, was done under terms of the British and the British Empire. What the Black liberation struggle has demanded from the 19th century and in the 20th century and in the 21st century, as you see with the Black Lives Movement, and we see with the mass rebellion that emerged in the wake of George Floyd's killing in May of last year, is a demand, not just for not just for the redressment of this or that injustice, but for fundamental transformation of society. So Black emancipation in the 21st century means humanity's emancipation. And I think it's extremely a central project, as Beckles has pointed out, because if we do achieve true African and emancipation in the 21st century, whether those in the diaspora, on the continent, it necessarily will mean a fundamental reordering of the way the world is structured. And that will benefit to everyone on this planet. Thank you.
Thank you, Isaac, for those tremendous words. I take away a number of things from it. Thank you so much. Emancipation is an unfulfilled project. Black emancipation means humanity's emancipation, a fundamental transformation of society in which the humanity of Africans is at the center. So this whole issue of the humanity of Africans from the very beginning of the transatlantic slave system to the Haitian Revolution, in which Haiti was penalized by the great powers at the time, to 1834, when the Emancipation Act was proclaimed, but which, as Beckles knows, was such a racist piece of legislation because it paid the slave owners for their property, and the property received nothing. The property, i.e. Africans, who were not seen as human beings, but as Africans. So I want to thank our three distinguished panelists, Greg Nazaire, Barb Hamilton-Hinch, and Isaac Saney. And I just want to end by saying, and I introduced the idea, and Isaac certainly followed up on it, this whole idea of reparations. Why reparations is a must. About 2 weeks ago, Jamaica presented its claims for reparations to the British Parliament. I'm sure some of you saw it on Twitter and on other social media platforms, this idea of reparations coming from Jamaica and also coming from CARICOM, the Caribbean community, the 14-member. CARICOM has about 14, 15 members now, presenting its claim for reparations to the great powers, to Britain in particular. So it's a movement whose time has come. And I just want to say reparations, the whole idea of it is not something new. From the very get-go, from the end of slavery, even before slavery ended, in whichever jurisdiction, the Africans themselves started talking about reparations and started pressing for reparations. There's an African-American woman by the name of Callie House, House. She, in the late 19th century, early 20th century, she began a movement for reparations, or to get pensions for people who had been enslaved and who were now elderly. Of course, the government arrested her and penalized her greatly. So I want to open it up to the audience. We had 3 speakers who gave some thought-provoking insights, and I'd like people to engage with this notion of emancipation. And it's wonderful that the Canadian federal government and our own senator from Nova Scotia, Senator Wanda Bernard, helped to make this a reality. It's great that the federal government has federalized the Emancipation commemoration. But as has been said before by Professor Hinch, that people throughout the world have been commemorating emancipation since 1834. In fact, even in the United States, Black people there, they weren't part of the British Empire at the time, they were commemorating August 1st. They saw that as their July 4th. They thought July 4th was the white man's holiday, the slaveholders' holiday. Emancipation Day was a holiday for the Black people. So from 1834, you look at the documents for Toronto, for Owen Sound, for Hamilton in Ontario, across the river in Detroit. African Canadians and African Americans have commemorated this day throughout the 19th century rather, and the 20th century, and now the 21st century. But a lot of food for thought here, and the conclusion is that we're not yet fully emancipated, because we have not yet set the term, we haven't set the terms for that emancipation, and Africans are still not, the humanity of Africans on the continent and around the world is still not recognized. And the global project for liberation continues. Thank you. So Tanya, we're gonna open it up now to the audience.
Yes, there's a few questions that we have here. I'm just going to get to the first one here in the chat. History tells us the recipients of emancipation weren't free in the true sense. Neither have we reaped the benefits of freedom. What should emancipation in its true form look like for Black African descendant peoples in Canada today?
Well, any one of the panelists can take it up.
I liked how both Greg and Isaac, Dr. Saney and Nazaire, as well as Dr. Cooper, talked about reparations. And I think we need to think about how do we define reparations? And when you think about the amount of money, and I know that's evident in one of the reports, the Lord Dalhouse report and other reports, and even in some of the literature and research that has been profited from slavery, from people being enslaved. We really need to define, in the land that has been stolen by people of African descent, and thinking about Afric film, thinking about beach film, thinking about many of the historical Black communities, and thankful for the land title fight that continues to this day, that's being supported by the provincial government. We really need to look at what would reparations look like, and how do we advocate for that? And so for me, yeah, I think we have to really take that into consideration.
Isaac here. And I think that, when I think of, and to build on what Barb was saying, I think it means authentic self-determination for people of African descent. There's some basic things, like we can think of Africville, as she's pointed out. We think of the land that's been lost, right? We can think of, reparations is more than just economics. It's about changing the social relations, right? I know I mentioned, and the changing of these social relations benefit not just people of African descent in Canada or elsewhere, but the entire society. And I'd like to remind people that the civil rights movement broke out in the United States. The women's liberation movement, right? And the LGBTQ liberation struggle, they drew on that, right? And even the American Indian movement, right? Okay, which was the indigenous struggle there, also had very close connections with the civil rights movement and the Black Power movement, right? So this idea, I think, of Black liberation is an all-encompassing one for humanity. When it comes to the Black community, I really think it comes around authentic self-determination, right? And what that means is people of African descent in Canada having a meaningful say, okay, in how their societies are run. I think in Canada itself, right, it needs to acknowledge that Canada, Canada has a fundamental conceit, right? Some people are probably surprised that slavery existed here. Okay, people are probably surprised that we have Canadian ruling classes and elites who were implicated in investment in a transatlantic slave system. Slavery is not something that happened in the United States, right? So I think one of the fundamental conceits that we see in Canada is the refusal to acknowledge that the enslavement, the dehumanization, the degradation of Africans, right, is fundamental for the creation of Canada itself. We have two primary victims of colonization in Canada, of course, the indigenous peoples, and we're witnessing what's emerged with the residential school, the physical and cultural genocide rained down upon them, and the enslavement of Africans and the imposition of Jim Crow here. So Black liberation means recognizing this history in very meaningful ways and finding ways to actually facilitate and ensure that people of African descent have authentic self-determination, i.e. they are the ones who determine what happens in their communities.
Wonderful.
Yeah, I would like to add something to, because this is really a topic that really is dear to me and to all of us. When the word reparation, and I'm glad you both my esteemed colleagues they talk about the way we can not only seriously but very deliberately think about it. And this is not a joke because it's a one-time thing. And why I say that is because people think sometimes when we talk about reparation, sign a check. That's the worst thing that can happen to us. Worst thing ever. Sign a check. First of all, there's no money that can actually pay back. I can guarantee you this. If you take $200, 300 years ago, you account for inflation, multiplied by 10 slaves, and you tell me whether you have money to do that. No. Okay. But reparation is literally the structure. When we talk about systemic racism, stuff like that, it's all about the structure. I can give you $5 million today. If you have a system that is geared, designed against you, to be against you and protect just one particular person, cannot protect the most basic rights you have to succeed or right to even exist. We talk about police brutality. We talk about here harassment. We talk about the way you can't even find a contract if you start a business. You can't even afford a property because they're gonna remove it, take it off the market if you want to put some sort of offer on it. Even if you have that money and the system is still against you, you may go well, very, very well today, but the next generation will come back in the same situation. So when we talk about reparation, I see it as an assembly of many, 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 many policies. And to be honest with you, one thing, you want to help, take an example, take the Marshall Plan the US had for Europe, for Western Europe, compare it to whatever they, to what that was done in Africa in terms of aid, and tell me if it's the same. It's not the same. Marshall Plan, it was an overall plan. It was very comprehensive. It's not just, bites, of stuff. So reparation for me is more complex than that. Yeah. I gave you $5 million today. You don't have the capacity to create wealth, to generate wealth for future generation. You're gonna spend your time fighting racism again and again and again. Hey, the $5 million will be gone. To be honest with you, the most expensive form of reparation for very, I would say a structure like this will be to treat us the same. That will be the most expensive form of reparation. Treat us the same. And when I say the same, it's not, because people think not saying, not hurling, or insults left and right, or physically harm someone. Oh my God, we've come a long way. Everyone is free. No, no, no. I'm talking about when you all over scrutinize, deny opportunities, no matter what you do. Being harassed by the cop, you in a store, you can't even move without someone putting down your neck. Everything got into play, form that almost more level, some sort of like.
He's frozen.
Oh, goodness.
I think Greg is frozen, so.
Would you like to move on to the next question? Oh,
If you
there it
get
is.
rid of it, to be honest, but sign your check today and say, hey, I don't.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you, Greg. You were just frozen a bit just now, but thanks. Thank you so much.
All right.
We're going to move on to, is your next question, Tanya?
Yes, we have a few more here. An audience member said, thank you very much for an incredibly enlightening and thought-provoking presentation. Do you have any recommendations for further reading on the essentials of emancipation and liberation on a reading list? Any books out there that you'd like to suggest?
Well, Barb gave a list earlier on. And I think Isaac also talked about Richard Hart.
Yeah.
So they talk about those. There's a book that I would urge everyone to read. It's by Laurent Dubois,
Yeah.
DUBOIS. And it's called Avengers of the New World. And it's on the triumph and the success of the Haitian Revolution. I just think it's a brilliant book, personally.
Yeah, and along with that, C.L.R. James's book, The Black Jacobins, I think is critically important because he shows the relevance of the Haitian Revolution for struggles in the 20th century. And there's a beautiful book by Winston James called Holding Aloft the Banner of Ethiopia, which is about the African diaspora, right, in the Americas, right? There's so many books, Freedom Dreams by Robin Kelly, which talks about the fact that the unfinished struggle continues, right? And how the idea of what it means to be free, has become further enriched and expanded, over the decades and the centuries of struggle and so on.
I would have to also ask.
Barb, I'm wondering if you could write or type those titles in the chat.
Yeah, I can do that. And I'm also wondering, in terms of the question, who and the purpose, right? So when I think of the hanging of Angelique by our own Dr. Afua Cooper, and I absolutely enjoyed that book, and even how to be an anti-Black, how to be an anti-Black racist. So in white fragility, so it depends on what people are wanting to learn around the discussion that we're talking about, right? Like even the journey of the Black loyalists, are they looking for history about people of African descent from the diaspora? Are they looking for ways to educate themselves? Are there people who may be white who are joining the discussion for the first time? Are they looking for information that's relevant to Nova Scotia? Because I often challenge folks. I mean, we have 3 amazing museums in Nova Scotia that are opened, and in Birchtown, Africville, the Black Cultural Center, that all speak to the history of people of African descent and talk about those who have been enslaved. And when I think about Birchtown, the experience for folks to be able to see the houses that were built in the ground, for people to go and really see how some of our folks who came through the transatlantic slavery came and settled in Nova Scotia would be really important. And I will put some of the other ones in the chat, because we do have to still think about the impact of having been enslaved, that has created historical trauma for people of African descent. So we need to also talk about the trauma of our history as well as our strength and resilience. So I will put some of those in the chat.
If I may put a plug in for Dalhousie, Dalhousie University is in the process of developing, and Dr. Cooper is chairing the committee, and I also sit on the committee, a Black and African Diaspora Studies program at the university. And there actually are courses you can take. There's a course on African Nova Scotian history that's being taught this fall, as well as an introduction to African Canadian studies that Dr. Cooper and I have taught in various ways. I've taught it once or twice when she's been on sabbatical, but there are other courses available. There's even a course looking at race and philosophy by Dr. Chike Jeffers, right? That go into these things in detail. And there are other courses as well that are available. I could go into them. So they, you know, if you're interested, there are these courses at Dalhousie University that are increasingly going to be exploring this experience and looking at this, right, from the kind of critical experiences that we have. And as we mentioned before, we can, you know, there's the books that are available, and I would, and you know, Barb will put some of them in the chat, and we can put others in the chat as well. And also, you know, even going to the North Branch Library, the Halifax Memorial Library, they have a very good selection on the Black history at the North Branch Library on Cottagen Street, which is a very historic building in the Black community.
Yeah, and I also added the Lord Dalhousie report.
Yep, Lord Dalhousie report.
I led that panel and was the lead author of that book that looks at Dalhousie universities and Lord Dalhousie himself, the relationship to slavery and race within Nova Scotia.
Yeah, and that can be downloaded for free from the Dalhousie website.
Yeah.
We're actually going to have, so we should actually, you know, we should actually plug this as well, Afua, Dr. Cooper. We're basically going to have a conference in 2023 on slavery in Halifax, Nova Scotia, looking at slavery in its dimensions, international dimensions, North American dimensions, and Canadian and Nova Scotian dimensions. And because of the pandemic, it was originally planned for 2021, but, you know, we can't do it. It's now scheduled for 2023, but we're going to have a virtual event in October. Okay, that's going to look at the, you know, this idea of slavery from reparations perspective. In
October of 2021.
Yeah, of this year, October of 2021. So people should keep their ears peeled for that.
Right, and thanks, Isaac. I was thinking, Tanya, that we there are several books in the chat here. Mm-hmm. If the list could be organized, and if the library could want to put it some place on their website
yes.
for readers, yeah.
That's a great idea, thank you. So we have some more questions from the audience. In Nova Scotia, does restoration mean land endowment fund, or does the panel have some ideas?
If I may, I mean, I think what it means is for the community themselves to decide, right, and have a meaningful input in what it means, right? You know, for, you know, in cases of Africville and other communities, like, you know, which will have lost land, it's a question of preserving these historic communities. But it's up for the community to make those decisions, right? And, you know, I mentioned the North Branch Library as this historic building, and what we in November 30th, 1968, a huge Black family meeting, a Black political meeting took place, which was a very powerful example of African Nova Scotian self-determination, and huge debates broke out there. So I think it's for the community, in a sense, to decide. I think first and foremost, the society and the governing institutions have to recognize that restitution, that slavery happened here, Jim Crow and segregation happened here, that it's had a very negative impact, obviously, to say the least, it's on the African Nova Scotian community. I always like to point out that if we look at the public education system in Nova Scotia, the first Public Education Act, and I can be corrected if I'm wrong, was in 1811. From 1811 to 1954, we had de facto and de jure separate and unequal education for people of African descent in this province. That's 143 years. From 1954 to now is only 67 years. So African Nova Scotians have been educated more than twice as long in a system deliberately geared to give them unequal education such that they would only fit into very low socioeconomic positions in society. And the society needs, and the governing institutions need to understand it, and the state needs to take responsibility. So that's an important step. But how this reparation takes place really has to be something that organically comes from the African Nova Scotian community. And it may involve land, it may involve a fund, right? Okay, and you know, people think it's expensive. I'd like to point out that during the pandemic, a small group of billionaires increased their wealth by $1.9 trillion, right? Okay, while, you know, workers lost almost equally the amount for the vast majority of people. So the wealth exists, but at the end of the day, this is a project that has to be designed by the African Nova Scotian community.
Yeah, I would agree with Isaac around that it can't not just be land. And when I see the number of young students still not going to post-secondary education and completing it, that concerns me. And I applaud the Afrocentric cohort that recently graduated from Auburn High School, where they had 21 students graduate, all high academics, all going on to post-secondary, and many with scholarships. So we do need to look at what can we do within the public education system, where there still are lots of challenges to support learners of African descent. Where can we look at in terms of post-secondary education? I know that many of the universities have recently launched and are supporting education for children who've been in care. And I appreciate the rationale and the reason for that. But have we looked at free education or reduced education for people of African descent as a form of reparations in terms of some of the challenges and opportunities that have been provided by this country, by this province, because of people of African descent? So I think that, again, having individuals name what we mean by reparations and what could that look like, a healthcare system that reflects us. I'm thankful that we are going to begin to be collecting race-based data, but making sure that any research that is done takes into consideration us as people of African descent in the diaspora, and it often does not. Funding for research. So the list goes on in terms of what kinds of ways can we be supported when we speak of reparations.
Thank you, Barb.
Yeah, there's a question here for you, Dr. Isaac. Please elaborate on how restoration will benefit not only Black people, but all of humanity. It's important to recognize that some of the viewers of tonight's event are in other parts of Canada and beyond. This person who asked the questions, they're actually in Toronto. Oh, you're on mute. Let's on mute.
It's not a Zoom webinar or meeting unless somebody forgets to take them. Okay. And that's a very important question. And I think, I answered it in a general way. I think because, how shall I put it this way, right? The socioeconomic system that we've lived in for the past few hundred years has not only generated tremendous and obscene wealth for a very few people in the society, it's generated great immiseration and suffering for the vast majority. It's also now being demonstrated, I think, unequivocally, that this system is destroying the planet. We only have to witness with tremendous fear. I remember when I was an undergrad student, people were speaking about the ecological and environmental dangers that faced us. And I think we're all stunned at how quickly this situation has deteriorated. So given the fact that this system emerged from the super exploitation, first, there's the incredible decolonization and genocide of indigenous peoples in the Americas, right? Then it's the mass enslavement and kidnapping of Africans from Africa, right? Which generated the wealth that led to the consolidation of the economic system we live in. I think the research is very clear that we wouldn't live in this system. The system wouldn't exist, right, if it wasn't for the wealth, the coerced labor, and the wealth made off the backs and suffering of enslaved Africans, right? And also when the system of the transatlantic slave system came to an end, the subordination of countries of color continued, right? The amount of wealth that's actually made, the super exploitation and so forth. And of course, the exploitation that takes place within the countries of the West as well. So this, not only were they central to the emergence of the system, there's exploitation and subordination is central to the continuation of the system. So their liberation, their emancipation will necessarily mean the emancipation of all of us. It will be a necessary but not sufficient condition, because all the problems, particularly of the environment, will require human beings to come together to solve these particular issues. I'd also like to remind people as well that when it comes to this issue, it's very interesting. If you look at the history of Black-white relations in North America, particularly the United States, it's always seen as always this interminable, time immemorial contradiction, right? But historians have shown that early Black-white relations in North America were actually defined by class. Okay, the majority of Europeans were poor. A lot of them were indentured servants, and there's a history of joint rebellion with Africans, right? Okay, and when this happened, it was seen by ruling elites, right, as an unacceptable challenge to their power. And so they began to pass laws, right, that deliberately created whiteness and whiteness and blackness as separate categories. And then they constructed this system of white supremacy. White supremacy, perhaps may have given psychological comfort to, this extreme racists and so forth. But when one looks at certain socioeconomic data, right, it doesn't benefit the majority of people of European extraction. In fact, it's used by ruling classes to drive down their wages and so forth. When Black wages rise, white wages rise. Okay, white wages rise well. So white supremacy, while its primary victims are people of color, okay, it also, in a sense, is not benefiting the vast majority of people in North America and the European world. So the elimination of this system will benefit all of us, right? And I think that's a central idea. Black liberation necessarily entails humanity liberation, not because it's a fancy phrase, but because of the central role that Black oppression and exploitation played in the emergence of the system that we live in now and its maintenance.
Thank you, Isaac. I also want to add that we can all think about reparations in another way, and that's debt forgiveness. Many of the countries that were, in which the Abolition Act was proclaimed in 1834, many of these countries and countries in Africa also are enthralled to European monetary organizations like the IMF, the World Bank, the Paris Club. So, will Jamaica ever get out of its debt? Will Argentina ever get out of its debt? Will Chile ever get out of its debt, right? And then these institutions like the IMF, they impose these, what I can only call evil conditions on these countries. Cut your healthcare system, cut education, cut lunch programs, cut nutrition programs for babies, just pay us the money. So you have countries like Zambia, for example, that's paying most of its income to these financial institutions. So most of the income that Zambia earns doesn't go to the Zambian people. It goes to pay off the debt. So we're saying that debt forgiveness is another form of reparations, because we will never be able to pay off those debts. When emancipation was proclaimed, when abolition happened, as I said earlier on, power still remained in the hands of the planters, in the hands of the Europeans. The Black people were again marginalized, pushed to the side. If you look at countries in Africa, it's just incredible. The US has these massive military bases in so many African countries. France is recolonizing Africa, or has recolonized Africa. You have France with all these, again, massive bases, and France is still stealing the wealth of Africa. So what's going on? Has slavery ended? Has colonization ended for many of these countries? No. So we have to experience debt forgiveness, and otherwise we are in serious trouble as it is. It's not that we're going to be in serious trouble. Things are dread as they are right now for these countries in Africa, the Caribbean, Asia, and Latin America.
Yeah. And if I may
add something, okay, I'm sorry.
So sorry, but just building on what Greg had said, like about structural change. Reparations is about structural change, and that's what Dr. Cooper is talking about, the changing of the system. If we remember, and people don't remember, we have short memories. In the 70s, there was a call for a new international economic order, which was about this restructuring, right? Changing these unfair systems, right? And so forth. And of course, and it was a recognition that the system was unsustainable and generating misery. And I also remind people that we live in a time of existential dread. And when we look back to the idea, when we talk about the struggle will, that this, we talk about in a sort of an academic fashion, the struggle of Black liberation will lead to humanity liberation. I think when we look at the mass rebellion in the wake of George Floyd, it was Black-led, but it was a multiracial, multi-generational uprising in a sense, right? The largest in US history, right? And resonated here in Canada. And ordinary people, the people who are people who are white, people not of color, saw this struggle as being essential struggle, not just to support morally, but as a central struggle to creating a just society. So I think the younger generation recognizes that Black liberation, right, is a central element in creating the kind of just society that everybody wants to live in.
Thank you.
Can I ask something? I'm glad you mentioned that. Just to do a follow up about the debt. John Adams say one day, there are two ways you can dominate a country, another country: war, debt. War, debt. And when we think about the debt, it is again designed. It is designed to be almost a zero-sum game. Okay, and some people will say, well, it's because it's bad governance and blah, blah, blah. Yes, but I'll give you an example. Not too long ago, I think it was late 1990s or late 1990s, the Canadian government lent some money. It was around 25 million or 30 million to Botswana. The moment the money was transferred, I think the king or the prince or whatever actually bought a Bombardier, which is a Canadian aircraft with the debt. It's serious. The debt. We have to. CBC actually had to literally broke the news, and it was an outrage. Taxpayer will pay, for it, and the gentleman bought a private jet with the same money and bought a Canadian-made private jet, right? And the debt, if you see, they know. People are giving the money, they know where the money is going.
Yeah.
Okay, and what is outrageous is if you go to a bank and ask for a mortgage, your bank will make sure the money is tied to a property. They're gonna make sure that this is what you plan to buy. No one get $400,000, $500, and you live without being accountable. The bank has to make sure. But when they're signing the check to another country, hey, you want to build roads? Hey, there you go. But you owe me. And it's changing more, just a bit more, because I think the Bretton Woods, agreement literally was shattered because China got into the game with better conditions, and it's not because of altruism, it's because it's politics, right? But the debt, like mentioned, the debt, it's almost like being weaponized against those poor countries, literally. And I'm glad you mentioned the debt. Yeah.
And a point on top of that is that, it's the interest payments that when Dr. was talking about it, it's the interest payments. They're not paying back on the principal because they can't afford to pay back on the principal. So the actual debt that's been borrowed in some of these has more than been paid back. Yeah. 2 or 3 times. The studies have shown it, right? And then it's used to cripple and deform these countries, when I use that term.
But I think we can also forget about what's been stolen from these countries. Yeah. That if the countries were able to keep their own gold and diamond and minerals that continuously are raped from the continent and are continuously taken out of the country and polished and sold for billions of dollars, then that in itself would pay their debt. There wouldn't be a debt. Like, there is no reason why we should be in this situation when we think about Mother Africa and all that Mother Africa has, and other countries, and even in the Caribbean, how we have been raped for years and years historically of our natural resources, at somebody else being able to profit off of that, and then saying we have a debt to them.
Yeah, absolutely, Barb. And that's because true emancipation didn't happen, true decolonization didn't happen. People are talking about, neocolonization and so on, post-colonization, but there's no post because we're still, in the throes of a colonial moment. Of course, the people are fighting, people are resisting, people have fought, people have resisted. You did have official in the political independence, but if if you, I look at the situation in so-called Francophone Africa, where many of these countries still have to pay the tax. It's called l'impôt colonial, the colonial tax, to France to this day. And these countries are supposedly independent. And the kind of aggression and bullyism that the French Republic carries out in Africa, it's just astounding. So someone said that until Africa is free, we in the diaspora will not be free. There's a lot of truth to that.
Yeah.
I wanted to ask Greg about if he could speak to the impact of the assassination of President Moïse.
Yeah, I mean, for now, it's great uncertainty. Okay, and while we're talking about uncertainty, it's under control. It's under control. But when we say uncertainty for the Haitian citizen, for Haitians, but for policymakers from State Department and actually even the intelligence community, whether it's Canada, whether it's Canadian, whether it's American, they actually know what's going on. They don't know the key players. They because don't forget, a lot of, I'll say, police and intelligence and law enforcement infrastructure are being provided by the US, by Canada. So they know. Asians, they don't know what's going on. But yes, there is uncertainty, but it's literally under control. And even the fact that the acting prime minister, first of all, what he said, well, we would welcome the US to actually, and people say, what's going on here? It's almost like it was almost staged in a sense. And that's why I say it's under control, but not within the country, but outside. And he was very close to the US government, right? The president was assassinated. One of the reasons was because he won't relinquish power by any means, right? And all of a sudden, he was gone. And it's still, everyone has some doubt about what's going on, the clarity of the situation. But for now, we can say this is something that is under control, but in Washington. I am going to be very honest with you, under control. Because otherwise, I would have had, I would have heard panic, right? You would have had a lot of panic in Washington, right? A lot of panic in Washington.
Thank you. I think I unmuted myself. Tanya, if there are more questions, because I have a question.
Yeah, there's one that I missed. I'm just there's one left. Yeah, there is one here from the audience member. Dr. Saney stated that the anti-Black racism is the child of transatlantic slavery. Can you unpack this for the benefit of those who may not be able to connect this relationship?
Oh, and I think Dr. Cooper can also weigh in on this topic. I mean, the issue is that, anti-Black racism as a systemic issue that is inherent and inheres at all levels of society, really in a direct sense is a product of the transatlantic slave system. As Eric William points out, racism is a product of the transatlantic slave system. It's not the cause of it, right? And so what happens is, obviously, in order to justify, and these people consider themselves Christian, the Enlightened movement was kicking off, that in order to justify all of this, right? Okay, and at the same time be, shall we say, moral human beings in their eyes, they had to create a system of justification, right? And so various theories, first taken from the Bible and then linked later on in colonization through scientific racism, right? Pseudo-scientific racism, came up with the ideas of African inferiority, right? So it was a means of justifying how, for the first time in history, because slavery is an ancient institution having different forms and so forth. But for the first time in history, one group of people who could be phenotypically identified were the sources of the enslavement, right? And so what happens is as the transatlantic slave develops, in order to justify it, to justify the brutality and justify the negation of their humanity, this justifying system of racism emerges, right? This ideology, right? Okay, that's not to say that notions of racism didn't exist before. And people debate this in the literature, but where it becomes such a fundamental constituent part of the global system, particularly in the what we call the Atlantic, right, the Western system, it's directly linked that for 400 years, a group of people taken from, obviously the humanity taken from the African continent were reduced to the most incredible brutality, right? And so we have theories emerging, for example, that Africans are subhuman, right? Africans are necessary to be beast of burden. Africans don't feel pain. Some people don't realize that some of the medical advances that they developed, right? Like some in the 19th century, were developed by people deliberately experimenting on Africans without giving them anesthetic, because they had this belief that Africans did not feel pain, did not have the same kind of intellectual capacity and emotional capacity to suffer as other people did. So racism emerges, and people have done the studies to look at how racism itself emerges at a particular moment, right? As slavery becomes the predominant enterprise in the West to justify the enslavement, brutalization, dehumanization of Africans.
Can I add something, like just a bit, please?
Sure, go ahead.
I'm glad Dr. Saney just mentioned am I free?
Yeah, you're unmuted. Yeah, please. Go ahead. Yeah, please go ahead.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you. I think you're frozen, but we can still hear you. So please go ahead.
Okay. Yes. Yes. Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Cooper. Racism, it's really about racial hierarchy. Racial hierarchy. And when I say racial hierarchy, it's a hierarchy that is based on social economic power. Before the slave trade, to follow up on what Dr. Saney just mentioned, before the slave trade, I mean, if you take the Roman Empire, you had white slaves, you have black slaves, you have, brown slaves, you have white slaves in North Africa, way back then, right? Back then, your parents can actually define where you're from, but it wasn't about race like as a construct, because right now, when you talk about racism, it's not just being different, it is really a hierarchy. It's not just the color of the skin. Otherwise, to preserve that, to preserve that privilege or whatever it is, no one would get 10. We find with this, it really about a hierarchy, and it starts with the transatlantic slave trade, right? Before that, it was, hey, he's darker, and that's fine, right? Probably from another tribe, from another, country, whatever it is, but that was fine. But that sense of superiority and inferiority of one group, vis-a-vis the other one, that sense of superiority, it wasn't there before, right? So yes, that's Dr. Saney is right, 100%.
Yeah. And it's also important to understand that race doesn't make biological sense. Any scientist, the vast majority of biologists will say, no, there's no real there is. It's, as you point, it's a social and historical context that emerges in very specific conditions and so forth. And I sort of alluded in a previous answer. So you can actually, in the United States, in places like Virginia and so forth, actually trace the history of when the ruling elite decides to intervene for their own interests, right? To break labor solidarity between poor whites, right? Okay, poor Europeans and Africans who are rebelling together to create this division, right? And that's where, white supremacy emerges as a system. It emerges out of, very concrete material conditions.
So thank you, Isa.
Yeah, but I think, but it's very important still to keep it so that we still do recognize the fact that even though it's a social construct, there still is a lot of power, as you talked about, Greg, Dr. Nazaire, about how people look at us as racialized and as Black people, to the point of the darker, the lighter, the one-drop rule, the paper bag test. We know that all of those things existed. And even when you talked about having social power and political power, we know who people are most comfortable with in certain positions. And even in terms of who are people most comfortable with the way some of us present ourselves or articulate ourselves or debate in discussions. So we know that there's a continuum of acceptance of Blackness and Black people. And so I bring that up because we have to talk about that liberation and emancipation. It's connected. So there may be some of us on certain continuums of our Blackness that may feel or experience more liberation as we get closer to the whole white race, as we talk about. And there's those of us that are going to experience different levels still of feeling invisible. And I think that that's important to talk about, because it's a real experience. It's a lived experience of those of us who are dark brown and those of us who may not be. And I'm not trying to have this debate around colorism, but you brought it up, Greg, that we are treated differently by our skin tone, the color of our skin, how we articulate, our education, our language, it's all together. And that's where we have to think about our social power, political power, our educational power, our economical power, because race is real. And it is still used to separate us from sometimes each other's and from other groups of people. So I just wanted to really make that point.
And that's why part of the reparations discourse is about psychological and spiritual repair, right? So even though race has no biological reality, it has a social reality. And if you want to actually see it in action, you have to go to Latin America and places like Brazil, where they're obsessed with classifying people. There are hundreds of ways in which they classify people. Even full siblings who have the same mother and father may come up looking differently because you know genetics operates, and they can be classified differently, right? And so there's this psychological thing that emerges. So when, everybody remembers when James Brown came out, I'm Black and I'm proud, right? That wasn't just a song, it was a response to the degradation and devaluation of what it meant to be Black, right? Particularly to be dark, right? And everything around hair texture and everything, right? And so so racism, has historical origins, right? But there's also a profound psychological cost it has, a sickness it has, right? They talk about it's like a disease that's generated in the system. And you rarely see it. And when we talk about the one-drop rule in North America, you rarely see it in its full nature in places like Latin America, where they have a whole variety of ways and terms to classify people. It's absolutely, truly bizarre and quite disheartening to see.
Yeah, thank you, guys. I also want to talk about or add to that this whole idea of Black inferiority. It wasn't, we're talking about the ideological justification for slavery, and that came, these forms of justification, ideologies came from the highest level of society. Here in Nova Scotia, Lord Dalhousie talked about the Black people as constitutionally lazy, as biologically inferior. Thomas Jefferson, who one of the architects of the United States Constitution and former president and Virginia intellectual and slave owner. He owned over 400 people, slept with one of them, Sally Hemings, gave her children. If you look at his writings, he also taught, he said, Black people are just inferior. Then he comes back and he said, well, when they mix with white, and he's talking about his own plantation, he said he sees that there's an elevation in their intellect when they're mixed race, when they're mulattoes. He didn't say that's the way to go, to elevate the race, make them mixed race or mulattoes. He was doing that with Sally Hemings, by the way. But he's part of the 1%. He's going to be president. He's a framer of the Declaration of Independence. He's a very important man. And he has these ideas. He was a white supremacist, he was a racist. So imagine that these people construct, this ideological superstructure of Black inferiority and white supremacy. that is still impacting us to this day. And so the emancipation and liberation, as has been articulated, has to take, the attack against it has to come from several fronts. I wonder if there are any more pressing questions, because I am aware of the time.
No, I don't. It looks like we got everything wrapped up.
Okay, great. So panelists, do you have one final word? And I know no one is going to give one final word because you guys are so great. You're so brilliant. You're so articulate. But if there's something you want to say to sum it up, to wrap it up, please go ahead. How you, Barb?
I'm trying to think profoundly to sum up this discussion, because it's such an important conversation. And as a person of African descent, who's lived in Nova Scotia most of my life and experienced racism on a daily basis, and have done several talks, and I often have told people that I don't feel safe as soon as I leave my house, that I am aware of who I am as a person of African descent. And there are very few people who understand that unless you are racialized and a person of African descent. That there's almost always this feeling of, am I going to be stopped? Am I going to get proper service? Are my children safe? And so if you can imagine living 365 days of the year like that, never feeling free, relaxed, not tensed, not being questioned. So when we ask the question about emancipation and liberation, I tie that to myself personally. And I tie that to my personal experiences of what I feel as soon as I leave my home. Am I free? Am I liberated? Am I under the guise of the government, the police, the education system, my employers, as a person of African descent? And I'm always conscious that everything I do will reflect on my brothers and sisters of African descent. And again, there's very few cultures and people who have to think like we do as a people. But on a good note, I can say I would not trade that for the world, because I feel the unity, the strength, the resilience, the pride, the support, the compassion, the dedication of people of African descent. And I know that in that unity, there is strength and there is power. I am very proud to be a person of African descent and a descendant of Mother Africa.
Thank you so much. That was brilliant. Thank you. Thank you so much, Barb. That was so heartfelt. Yeah. Thank you. Thanks so much. Greg?
Well, I think it was a great discussion. And like I mentioned, to just hear what Dr. Hamilton-Hinch just said, yes, it's a struggle. And yes, we are resilient. When I say we are resilient, I don't think other communities, sometimes even other, I would say a white person would take so much from another white person, right? It's, yes, we are resilient. And honestly, to be treated like a normal person, like a human being, with the dignity, like with literally the proper dignity, with humanity. Yeah. That's all it is. No one is playing the victim. I'm not. But I was victim of racism, like big time. But I never play victim. It's because it's right there. I usually say, I've done everything in life I was asked for. And tried to run away from, but for some reason, skin color always tried a way to find me. So it's not when someone, when they hear us talking about it, it's almost like we go and find racism. No, racism, and we tried everything and always trying to find a way to find us, right? So treat people with dignity, I mean, it's, to be honest with you, it's very Christian, because we claim to be Western Christian, Judeo-Christian, culture. That's what Jesus said. Jesus said the most important thing to do is to treat somebody else the way you would like people to treat you. That's very Christian. If you claim to be a Christian person, if you claim to be, a Christian, from the Christian, Judeo-Christian civilization, which is basically the best supposed to be, why don't you follow it? Follow the principle of our Lord, and everything will be fine. So that's it. Thank you very much.
Greg. Thank you so much, Greg, for those words of wisdom, equality and dignity. Thank you. Those words are brilliant and wise. Isaac Saney, final word from you?
Yeah, I just like to say,
Isaac, it won't be a word, right?
No, I'd just like to say that, when I think of this, I think of what Dr. Burnley Rocky Jones said, the historic African, Nova Scotian African Canadian contributed so much to the struggle for human rights and liberation in Canada. And he often said, freedom is a constant struggle. And, Black liberation and genuine emancipation obviously is an unfinished project, but it's now more necessary than ever, not just because it's so intimately entwined at the core of the liberation of humanity as a whole, but it's at the core, I think, of the possibility of humanity surviving the kind of trials and tribulations and challenges we face in the 21st century. I've talked about an existential dread. I've talked about, I think, a fundamental need to remake the world. And I feel this increasingly as I have a young daughter, what kind of world she's going to inherit. And I wanted to live in a world in which the envelope of human freedom is continually expanded, right? And in which everyone can truly have an experience of emancipation and liberation. And if we're truly to have that for every single human being on this planet, at the core of this struggle is Black emancipation and liberation.
Thank you so much, Isaac, for those amazing words. Thanks to all of the panelists. I want to thank the Tanya from the Halifax Public Library, and thank the library also for hosting or co-hosting this event on the eve of Emancipation Day, August 1st. I want to thank Ayo from HRM and from HRM itself for putting its weight behind this panel. And as all our panelists have said, the struggle continues, the conversation continues. Let's keep talking about this. Some very wise words were shared tonight, great insights. It's truly, truly wonderful. And I want us to take this discussion to our communities, to our places of worship, to our homes, among our children, to our educational institutions, to the libraries, to the street corners, to the workplaces, to the offices where we congregate and gather. And in memory of our ancestors, and also I take this time to give strength to all our peoples around the world who are struggling for justice, freedom, for dignity, and for equality. I thank our audience for staying with us and for tuning in. This is wonderful. Thanks again to everyone.
Wonderful. Thanks, everyone. And I want to remind everyone, too, that tonight's program has been recorded and will be posted on the library's YouTube channel. Good night, everyone, and enjoy your evening. Thanks. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Good night.